Welcome to Conversations Matter. I'm Hans Hickler.
And I'm Molly Bergholm.
Molly and I are big fans of having real, deep conversations. So sit back, relax, be present, and really enjoy this one. I'm super excited. Today, Molly and I have a chance to speak with David Bornstein. David is a journalist and an author. He's written 3 books. He is the definitive expert on social entrepreneurship. His book, How to Change the World, has impacted people around the world, including myself. It really was the catalyst for my involvement to work with social entrepreneurs, people who are looking to change the world systemically around important social issues like poverty, medicine, climate change. And David has made this his life's work. First and foremost, he's a journalist, and he uses a journalistic style called solutions journalism, which he's going to tell us about. But Molly, this guy, this David Bornstein, he's something special.
He's changed my life too, and I'm so excited about today.
So it's a real pleasure. I also want to say that Molly and I have a little bit of 6 degrees of separation going on with you, because almost everybody we talk to says, "Oh yeah, I know David," and there's some kind of connection. So
and they all think you're like the best guy.
Yeah,
and they all like touch their heart and say, "He's so great."
So we've really been looking forward to this.
Oh, well, thank you.
Thank you.
I'm just going to ask the easy and most top of mind question for me. What got you involved in all of this writing about social entrepreneurship? How did that start?
Yeah, how did it start? That's a good question. I mean, there's sort of the surface level. At my first career, I was a computer programmer and a computer analyst, programming things for stop-and-go foods, convenience stores, and Barney's, and all these big chains. And I just kind of had to leave that work because I knew that, but I loved problem solving. I could be up till midnight. Then I quit that work and I moved to New York to be a journalist and went to NYU journalism school. And just while I was in journalism school, started writing for New York Newsday, which was this great paper that doesn't exist anymore. And I remember covering a murder. About a year into that work, I covered a murder of a woman. Her name was Maria Rodriguez. And I got these incredible details because her son saw it happen. It was a drive-by, it was sort of a shooting in the Bushwick area. And my editor just, he called me at 5 a.m. the next morning. Great details, fantastic story, great reporting. And I just remember feeling my heart sinking that, I'd put all this work into telling a story, and, what are you really contributing to New York to give this incredibly detailed account about how somebody was shot? And I remember thinking that I need to shift again, maybe my career, or at least shift the way I'm using this tool called journalism. And just around the same time, I heard about the Grameen Bank. A friend of mine had worked on a documentary. And so I went and I spoke to some folks who were working on this documentary. And then I remember just walking down Morton Street in Greenwich Village, and literally it was hit by like a flash of light between 2 buildings. The sun hit my face, and I just decided to go to Bangladesh. And I remember just thinking, I have to figure this out. I went back to I was living in the East Village in this tiny apartment for $283 a month. And my friend was sleeping on the floor. He was out of town. And I said, "Rex, you have to help me. I'm going to Bangladesh." And I remember he was still sleeping. He just looked up and he said, "Your mother will never allow it."
Right. Not many people wake up and say, "I just have to go to Bangladesh."
Right. But that was the beginning. And I ended up, it took a while to figure it out. And I remember corresponding with these handwritten notes to Muhammad Yunus, who was the founder of the bank. And eventually just went there and spent, over the course of 2 years, I spent about a year there. And then, and then I really saw a story, a book, but I saw something different. I saw that there was a way to sort of plug into telling a particular story, which was how people solve problems, which was this thing that I had always loved as a computer programmer, and just saw that you could sort of deploy it as a storyteller too. That was really the beginning.
So I have to share something with you of how your book influenced me, The Price of a Dream, which is about Muhammad Yunus and originally then we were calling it microfinance and industry, that he so amazingly expanded in this world awareness of, and in your book too, is a huge piece of that. I read your book when I was on my journey living in Asia. And at the time, my partner was a guy named Mike Hetwer, who's a photographer for National Geographic. He was doing all these dinosaur excavations in Africa with Paul Serrano and interesting stories. But I kept telling Mike, I said, Mike, you're a person who gets the suffering of the world. You get, how we need to make change. I said, forget dinosaur bones. You need to do a story about people, about how you can help people. And so I read your book, and then I sent Mike to Muhammad Yunus to do a story, which he did do a story, but it all started with your book.
Oh, wow.
And so then Mike went to Bangladesh. He did the story of Muhammad Yunus, and then while he was there, he discovered the shipbreaking industry that is something that is, as I know you're nodding your head, understanding is when these giant container ships, it's the graveyard that they send them to die in is in, one of the main ones is in Bangladesh. And he went to Bangladesh and he spent months there doing a story on how what ends up happening is these things are just filled with chemicals and asbestos and so many other things, and it just pollutes the sea and it pollutes the earth. It kills everyone who comes in contact. The average mortality rate's like 35, and a lot of times the parents die, so the children have to go work. So he has images of, 8-year-old children crawling into these little holes with blowtorches and no shoes, no protection for the skin or the eyes or the lungs. And then so many of them die. So he did this incredibly compelling story and film on the shipbreaking industry for National Geographic, and ended up going, to The Hague and the UN and all these other places. And it helped create the change that became, what are now better standards for that industry. But the thing I love about that story is it started with your book. And then when you go, it just that's so much about when I was reading, I just reread How to Change the World. When I went back to reread it, there's always these lines of connection between one thing leads to another thing that leads to another thing. And there's this insidious aspect to what you do. So I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit about how change breeds change and how it keeps... It's
interesting. It's kind of like the social mycelium of the world or something like that.
Exactly.
These kind of the ripple effects. I've heard about this over and over and over again. I mean, people give themselves an exposure to something. And if they have a real experience of meaning and they connect, then usually their whole life shifts. They typically can't stay on a trajectory that is not really who they really are when they've had an experience and tasted something. Mm-hmm. So if you're a photographer and your ability, you have this extraordinary ability to highlight things and to draw attention to things, and then the question will keep on coming up, like, where do I focus? What do I apply my attention to? And then it just ripples out. It's like dropping a stone in a puddle, or in a
But I would think that's exactly what you want as a journalist and an author, is people read your work and it impacts them enough for that to change them and for them to get motivated. And
that's the thing. And it's, when I look back on that book, How to Change the World, I have, people say you should update it. I actually am happy with it, fading into the... Because I think it's too much a collection of stories about individuals. And it is a bit falling into this idea of sort of like the great person theory of history, that there are these special people out there. I would look back now and see so many more people involved in each of these organizations. And, the social entrepreneur obviously is a key ingredient, the stock perhaps that holds all the other ingredients together in the soup. But, now I can see... in those organizations that were covered, many of the people who worked in them have gone on to do many other things too.
Yes.
So it's
one of the things that
many antibodies,
It's one of the things that was. I have many epiphanies about social entrepreneurship, but one of them was when I started advising Vera at Dara. That she's renamed her enterprise Dara from Saúde Criança. But when I was starting to advise her, I was the executive. How does she protect her business model and how to stop people from copying? And I remember having a conversation with Bill Drayton, the founder of Ashoka, and he said, Hans, when it comes to social entrepreneurs want their idea to be spread around the world. They're not about protecting their business model. They're about changing a system. And if that means somebody in Africa copies their system, that's great because we're changing the world. And it's one of those, and so when you say people have left and gone on to do other things, the way systemic social change happens is that way, right? And we as sort of business entrepreneurs can't sometimes relate to that. We have finite goals and objectives and budgets, and these social entrepreneurs very often don't have a clue about how to run a business, but they have a big clue about what they want to do in changing the world. And the rules are different.
Yeah, it's very different. It's, if you look at the organizations that have caused the most change are the ones that have elicited the most change. They've drawn out the most leadership and capacity from the widest number of people. They've shown people pathways to be effective, to be joyful in their lives that they haven't seen. I mean, microfinance is a good example of something that it's just a resource that can give other person, more power to have more control and more creativity in their life if it's done properly. So it's, and like the movement in Ashoka from sort of this focus on these sort of, quote, sort of top of the pyramid, social entrepreneurs that Bill used to define as, 1 in 10 million sort of kind of thing, to everyone a change maker, to the idea that actually what we're really talking about is drawing out, the healthy, subversive, creative potential of everyone.
Yeah.
And then connect that so that people can see, to be a kind of, to be able to make the contribution that you have with your own sort of gift package that you have, your collection of skills, abilities, all that stuff.
That was a real gift for me, that change maker thing, because I always tell people, when I advise them in business, entrepreneurs, I say, look, I've never had a great idea to start a company, but I'm really, really good at being the wingman to help you make that great idea a success. And I feel the same way about social entrepreneurship. I admire social entrepreneurs that have this ability to see beyond the current and see what change could be. But what Bill Drayton, the founder of Ashoka, he said, everyone a change maker, like you said. And I really jumped on board that bandwagon. I said, okay, I'm not a social entrepreneur, but I can be a change maker with my skills. I can help further the cause, for want of a better word. And I think that's a really important concept, that we all not only can be change makers, but have to be change makers.
So what are some examples that you've seen of people who aren't necessarily starting an NGO that goes into the favelas of Brazil and reforms how people receive healthcare? What are some examples of people you've seen who are doing more, I don't want to say like normal jobs, that have then applied the social entrepreneurship or the change maker strategies or perspective? It's not really a strategy. I guess it is a strategy, but also a perspective or philosophy to bring that to life. Because I think that's a lot of times, like people, let's say, who work at DHL or something like that they say, oh, well, I'm shipping things. How can I make change with that? Or do you have any examples like that?
There's so many. I mean, you can look at them, like we have, here at Solutions Journalism Network, we have funding partners. One of our, great funding partners is the Einhorn Family Charitable Trust, and Jennifer Rothberg and John Gruber and their colleagues. They as colleagues, as not really just representing philanthropy, but really like people who are always sharing their wisdom. They're brilliant strategists. They've really helped co-create this organization. I mean, there's a million conversations we've had that have shaped this organization. Now, we get the credit when we succeed, but there's all of these conversations there. Then there's people who are sort of the people who just come in and make organizations better. Like a friend now and board member and someone I wrote about in How to Change the World is this guy named Dean Furbish, who, was the early board member, I think board chair of College Summit when it just started. And then he went on to become the CEO of the organization. And he has, in a he has not been the front-facing social entrepreneur who's on the magazine covers and all that, but he's been behind the scenes. But someone who just is really terrific at creating an organization that, can rationalize all of these different people's behaviors and activities to meet its objectives. And so, so the entrepreneur is often very good at storytelling. That's kind of a big part of it. It's helping people see a vision that's usually over the horizon a little bit, which is why you need someone who can see it more clearly even before it's real, so that you can get people to invest in it and say, I'm going to join this organization, even though I don't really know what's around the corner just yet, but I have a family and I have a mortgage and all that, but I trust that it's going to happen, because they have that sense. And that confidence, that's really the key thing that the entrepreneur gives, is like this, it's kind of like, a small tree, like a sapling. It's those posts around it when it's very small that keep it strong enough until you can remove those posts. The entrepreneur sort of provides that initial protection of the idea and ability to go from nothing to something in the early years. And that's really the key thing. And that's where you really get to the fork in the road of the people like Vera, who let their ideas go and are comfortable not attaching themselves to their ideas. It's not about me and my recognition and all that. It's really making sure that this way of working gets integrated into hospitals and health systems. And then there's other people that are very sort of ego connected to their idea. It's an important part of who they are, and the recognition is really important to them. And they often haven't done maybe as much personal growth, but they might be incredibly good entrepreneurs. And you'll often find that they limit their organizations. Their organizations become too identified with them. Other people don't grow as much in the organization because there's this, big tree kind of casting shade over other people kind of thing. You see that all the time. And whenever you see a social organization that has poor retention rates or doesn't play well with others, all these things, you can usually connect it to the personality of the founder in many cases.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's harder to systematize that business model too, because it's so linked to that founder, right? So spreading it is
they haven't been thinking about how do I let go of it from day one. They've been thinking about how do I add zeros from day one.
Yeah.
So that's a whole different mindset,
What is the structure of a meaningful social entrepreneurship movement or experience look like to you?
I mean, I think now it's really recognizing that it's like in our organization, when we're teaching social entrepreneurship, one of the things we say is the idea is the hero, right? Because journalists are so used to writing about like the charismatic visionary and telling the story about whose face should be on the magazine or who are we going to profile. And we're like, no, actually, let's make the method the hero. The way of working. What is a better way to help veterans with trauma? What is a better way to help kids in Head Start who've had early childhood adversity and things like that? If you can describe that really well, there's 4 million teachers in the United States. They all need that, And so you can actually dramatically change things rather than focusing on the person, the great principal or the great person who started the organization. So I think, the thing that is really distinctive is in organizations recognizing that what we're here to do is we're in the business of helping everybody, be a more effective healer or a more effective teacher or a more effective steward of the land or a more effective doctor or whatever the things are that are needed. And when you start thinking the question isn't what should we do, the question is what needs to happen. What needs to happen in the world? And then sometimes what you need to do is try to get other people to do stuff. And so your technology might just be like relationships, persuasion, giving people exposures, right? And so and it's a very different way. It's moving away from this sort of geoengineering, sort of implementation kind of mode of entrepreneurship. And it's been helpful, but it's also been a hindrance, is that social entrepreneurship, when it entered the academy, entered through the business schools. And so it ended up getting this imprint of everything we know about business, running businesses. And like you were saying, you run a business, you want to maximize and capture. That's what businesses try to do. Whereas if you're running a social organization, you want to release. You want to let as many people. You want to empower the children to kill the parents ultimately, because that's really success. So it's a completely different mindset, and ultimately it's a different personality set as well. Different sets of goals, ways of working. I mean, the whole thing follows from a different. It's more like biomimicry than it is engineering.
When I started working with Vera, my first objective was for them to be more productive. The first meeting, the first time I went to Rio, I was waiting outside to meet Vera, and she was having a meeting with her team, and I swear it sounded like a pen full of chickens getting their heads cut off. And I walked in, and I said, first thing we're going to do is we're going to run more efficient meetings, because the meetings lasted 5 hours, and they were arguing, and there were 3 conversations going on, screaming at each other and crying. And Vera said, Hans, you don't understand. We're Brazilians, and we're women, and that's the way it is. And I said, you're going to find this hard to believe, Vera, but I've worked in Brazil for a long time, and I've worked with women for a long time. We can actually have an effective meeting. But I said, we got to run this a little more like a business. And Vera said, this is not a business. We will never be a business. We're about helping people. Now when I talk to Vera, I said, are we a business? She goes, yeah, we're business. We have to run like a business and not behave like a business. So there you go. But you're absolutely right. We and myself have thought initially about social entrepreneurism like a business. And I've had to let that go completely. And I've sort of truncated that and said, social entrepreneurs need all the help they can to organize themselves to be as productive as they can be, without hooking them into the sort of the principles of how a business runs and why a business runs. Disseminate the idea, but be productive internally, right?
I mean, look at the statement that just came out from business leaders around the world, that we have to change the way business runs. Because if we keep running our corporations with the same set of sort of decision rules that we've been running them, we've already destroyed close to a third of the Earth's ecosystems, yes, or degraded them seriously. There's 24% of the people in the world that are living in areas that are water stressed.
Yep.
And you think like, oh, what are the assumptions that are operating that would make all these individuals who actually are like just good, decent people, when they get into these things called corporations, behave as if the environment doesn't matter, or as if connection to place doesn't matter, or as if helping people transition when there's very fast-paced changes in the economy doesn't matter, or all of these things that you see businesses just ignoring as sort of what they used to call externalities and things like that. What makes people behave in a way that they would never behave that way in their personal relationships, but they behave that way when they're in their positions as CEOs or as VPs of whatever? And you think, oh, that's kind of a whole core set of assumptions that are in business that that business leaders are now recognizing, just because of climate change, need to change.
It's one of the remarkable things about working with social entrepreneurs is that they have that complete transparency. Who they are is their work. Their work is who they are. Whereas, as you say, in the business world, I spend a lot of time talking to CEOs about bringing their values into the boardroom, because who they are at work is not who they are at home and at church and in the things they love. It's almost like, I tell people, you don't go to work and leave one arm and one leg behind, but we do that with our value systems and how we behave and how we influence. There's a huge dichotomy between the CEO in the boardroom and that CEO at home. And I talk a lot about, bringing those values, bringing vulnerability into the boardroom, bringing who you are into the boardroom. I think that's what shared value is all about. I, as a CEO, have an obligation to share the things I believe in and what makes me tick with my team. And, one of the things I'm really proud of is that my team in Asia, in the last business agility I worked at, we put women's education into our business plan, and we built schools in the countries we served. And I just started that with sort of telling them what I believe in and what I want to do, and that we would have a people and community profit line in our P&L, just like we do a profit line. And one of the guys that worked for me, Morton, has taken that and run with it. His kids go to United World College that is really focused on social entrepreneurship, and he's sponsored schools. And he's become a completely different leader because he's brought himself to the table, and he motivates people, and he changes people's lives, and the communities of their employees where they work is impacted, and it's so fulfilling. And when you look at social entrepreneurs, that's just a natural. They're bringing all of them, everything they believe in, to the table. Their work is them is their work. And it's remarkable. And I think that's what you're seeing in these business leaders that are starting to change, is that that dichotomy at some point falls apart.
That split, the lack of integration.
Yeah.
There's a beautiful phrase that I think we can all weave in to our lives around that. It's that we can measure our wellness by the space between our contradictions. And when I say contradictions, I mean that I'm like this one place and like this another. Like, can we become fully integrated human beings? Can we do business with heart and consciousness and love? Yeah, big companies hiring us, they say, what do you teach? I say, I teach you how to listen, teach you how to be present, teach you how to connect with people, to care about what you do. That's the work, but we weren't brought up like that. And so what we see now, and what I love about what you're doing, is shifting the consciousness, because and what I love about Solutions Journalism Network is that our thoughts are creating our reality. And if we just read what is happening in regular mainstream world, our reality is a dystopia, versus what you're creating is the opportunity for people to have a new paradigm, that this world is actually filled also. Yes, there are problems, but this world also is filled with people who sincerely care and want to make a difference. Could you speak more about Solutions Journalism Network and what you're doing with this movement, as well as the role that the news plays in our lives?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's probably, I don't know, the ratio of social entrepreneurs to terrorists in the world is very high. It's like 1,000 to 1 or something. So, I mean, if you think about, what you now have with 24/7 global media captured far and wide by anyone who has one of these devices in their hand, which is billions of people, and if the news is basically the worst stuff that happened on planet Earth beamed to you every day, you could tell 10,000 horrifying stories every single day, because there's billions of people. And we now have the capability to capture those stories, to put them together, and to bring them to you. That's kind of what we do. So you're now having, basically the news has just become a smoke alarm that doesn't stop beeping. And it's always telling you, what you should worry about, what you should hate, what you should be fearful of. And which is why people are avoiding the news. I mean, the Reuters Institute that studies this in Oxford has found that news avoidance is on the rise, and they've seen it's quite high in the United States, in the UK. It's highest, I think, in Turkey, or one of the countries. So people kind of, as a self-protective mechanism, are putting their fingers in their ears and closing their eyes and saying they're immunizing themselves against this. So, but the question is really, the news should be a feedback system, just like anything else. And a feedback system to work needs to help you understand, what are the threats? What are the dangers? If you're not aware of threats and dangers, your head is in the sand. But you also have to know, what are our options? What are the possibilities that are available? And in some ways, it's the combination of awareness of the world's suffering and awareness of the world's possibilities that creates change. And that's a balanced diet, in a sense. That's like vegetables and protein kind of putting together. So the news, has historically been sort of half a feedback system, or I describe it as a really bad doctor's appointment. Like a really bad doctor's appointment is, you go to the doctor and, she takes the stethoscope and says, you have a problem here. Oh, you have a problem here. Oh, you also have a problem here. And then leaves, right? That's a bad doctor's appointment, because now you're all worried about all your problems and you have no efficacy. A good doctor's appointment is like, oh, by the way, there's a lot of treatment options. And then, by the way, here's the menu of options. Some are expensive, some are harder, some are you start, and what do you want to do? Maybe you want to make this decision with your family. So, but that's like the way a feedback system should work, and it can work at the individual level, it can work at the community level, or it can work at the societal or global level, depending on the nature of the sink of the problem, basically. And so that's what solutions journalism is all about. It's just about, if we're going to let people understand what their community is suffering from, and we work with hundreds of news organizations, many of them, in small rural areas or small towns, also big cities, also global. We hear opioids, mental health. How do we care for our elders? How do we improve food security? How do we build a post-Rust Belt economy? What are we going to do about the flooding that is more frequent, and the topsoil and the forest fires and whatever? And these are the things, and our broken education system and blah, blah, blah. And these are the things we hear about all the time from our editors. And we say, great, where are the positive deviants? Who are the people in this country with 3,300 counties, a huge country? If we're just thinking about U.S., you could also do this globally. Who are the 2 or 3% of the places that are doing something really smart? That's 100 stories of people who have mobilized a really smart response to opioids, or reducing, have seen, rates of obesity go down in their county, or in their county, or have seen the high school graduation rate go up, or whatever the thing you're looking at. Who are the people to learn from? So, and in journalism, there's you focus on the bad guys to mobilize outrage, because the theory is that people aren't outraged enough. But actually, in some cases, people are so over-informed about a problem that they've shut down. Mm-hmm. They've gotten paralyzed. It's not more outrage isn't going to wake them up. We also have to look at the positive deviants, the places that are doing the most effective things or the most promising things to circulate the knowledge. And that's and if you think about how the immune system works, if we take a vaccine and put it in your shoulder, like we do with a lot of vaccines, your whole body gets it, right? It's in your toe and your knee as well. Mm-hmm. So how does that work? That's a cross-pollination of knowledge system that goes from, that is mediated by the immune system. Journalism can mimic that by taking whoever has coming up with something smart, whoever inoculated their community against some problem, metaphorically. How do we make sure that the whole system can learn about that as quickly as possible, and in a way that that knowledge can lead to shifts in real insights that can make people more effective?
It's amazing.
And that's the whole theory,
From people feeling powerless to feeling powerful, like they can do something. They can make a difference.
It's a totally different way of looking at journalism, right? You're sort of journalism typically is the headline, this explosive headline that captures you, and then today's world, we don't even read the detail behind it. How many times has somebody read a Twitter feed and said, "Oh, there's a fire in the Amazon," and somebody says, "Well, what happened?" "Oh, I don't know. There's a fire in the Amazon." Yeah. So but where does typically in solutions journalism, where does it start? Are you seeing a headline and then saying, "Let me understand it," or I guess it can come from different ways. You can learn about somebody that's doing something amazing and then see sort of what is the systemic issue and other who are the points of light that are addressing this. How do you get your scoops, I guess?
Well, so we train news organizations, we teach other journalists, we help other news organizations and journalists to figure out how to do this well, basically, how to do it rigorously. Okay. So we're a B2B, I guess you would say. And we've worked with over 400 news organizations, and about 17,000 journalists have engaged with us, either through direct engagement, through their newsroom, or through lots of tools and resources that we have that are online. But the basic idea is, if you're a journalist, or let's say you're an editor covering, your job is to cover your town. So one of the things is, your job is to figure out what are the issues in my community that are really important that we need to be writing about. So those may be problems that people aren't aware of, changing trends in demographics or the environment or the economy or whatever. Typically, editors are very good at that. They talk to people all the time, and they're like, we got to do a series, about, the flooding, because we've had 300-year floods in the last 10 years, and this is something that our community really has to grapple with. So it's a known thing. Or we have to do something about the crime problem, or public safety or whatever it is. So that's not so hard for news organizations to figure out. It's always better to, they can survey audiences and figure out what are the issues. And then the main question is what's missing, right? So are people aware of this problem? Well, many problems people are not aware of. Like a lot of people in Cleveland didn't know that more than half, 50% of the children in inner city Cleveland were exposed to lead paint. That was just not well understood what a public health catastrophe that was. But once people know that the problem exists and you've done the investigation or the exploration, then the next thing to say is what's missing now? And what's missing now is, okay, what are our options? That's always the key question. What can we do about this? That's the main question that people have. And when people throw a wrench into the system, as we saw with the last election, many people who voted for Trump in the 2016 election, their motivation was, and this was something that was revealed by the Pew surveys, was we think that desperate measures are needed even if it makes things worse.
Right, they threw a wrench in the system.
2-1, a Republican to Democratic response. Yeah. We also had a very high predictor of a Trump voter, which is important to understand, was if they answered yes to the survey, people like me have no say. If in that survey question, if they said yes to it, agreed or strongly agreed, they were far more likely to vote for Trump than any of the other candidates, including the other Republican candidates.
Interesting.
So it was an expression of voicelessness or powerlessness. So you think, you have all these people in this country. I mean, this is a country that sort of gave participatory democracy its kind of continental scale application. And it's filled with a bunch of people who feel that they are powerless. They have a kind of civic anemia or something like that. So are they really powerless? Actually, no. I mean, we have stories, thousands of stories of groups across the United States and across the world that have changed things. I mean, what does that look like? So it's so important for journalism to capture that story and make it visible. We know what it looks like when someone goes on a shooting spree. Yeah. And we know what it looks like when somebody, is harassing the actresses in their company and stuff like that. We know what these stories look like now and what bad behavior is from celebrities and lying from politicians. But what does it look like? What does civic, decent power look like? Not even social entrepreneurship. Yeah. And how do we make sure that we see that every day? Because that's the curriculum by which we learn. I mean, when I was growing up in Montreal, how did I learn to play hockey? I just saw a million other people playing hockey. I knew how to make, we learned when we were little kids, how do you choose teams fairly? The older kids taught the younger kids. I mean, these things get passed on through cultures. But right now we have a news culture that has gotten so calcified and stuck on this idea that what's missing is more outrage and more awareness of problems. And that's really not
That's really
missing.
Interesting because like you take the shooting thing. Everybody knows there's a mass shooting happening every week. But if you translate that and say there's a good thing, this good thing, it happens every week, right? We are used to sort of very quickly tallying up the fear factor. This happens so much, I'm going to be really frightened about it, or I'm going to shut down about it, or whatever. But this idea that says there's somebody working here on this issue, but by the way, there are 100 people working on this. That's really interesting because I think we still see these things as, it's an individual trying to make change. And I think what I'm hearing you say is part of this kind of journalism is to say that there's actually a lot of this stuff happening. There's systemic stuff happening,
all the time. And the thing that journalism is struggling with, I've been thinking about this a lot, and basically, the 20th century produced a lot of extraordinary institutions. It produced institutions to protect the public, all of the institutions to restrict child labor and to tell companies that they can't behave this way, the SEC, all of these institutions. And there was this sort of belief in journalism that our institutions are pretty good, we just need to keep them clean and healthy. So let's clean out the dark corners and make sure that corruption doesn't happen and sunlight is the best disinfectant and all of that stuff. And so the basic idea was what's needed, it's the secrets that can harm us that journalists need to ferret out. We need to be good investigators to see where people are hiding bad things. And that's kind of what journalism became at its highest level. The Pulitzer Prizes are always given to people who uncover malfeasance. If the 21st century is we're seeing the pace of change is so much faster. And so what we're seeing now is so many of our institutions are just not up to the task anymore. It's not enough to just keep them clean and healthy. We have to reinvent them. And so it's the secrets that can help us. Where are ideas emerging all around the planet that could be useful and adaptive, that we could borrow an idea that they came up with in Thailand or they came up with in this small town. And so the secrets that can help us are just as important as the secrets that can harm us, and actually more important for transforming the institutions that are no longer what's needed for this pace of change and for planetary limits and all the things that we're up against.
So it's not about uncovering malfeasance, it's uncovering feasance.
Uncovering feasance, right. And putting them both together.
That's great.
Then when you have them both together and you can see, because actually when you uncover how people are solving problems, you also are uncovering how people fail to solve problems.
Yes.
They're just two sides of the same coin. It gives you the knowledge. And uncovering how people try to solve problems and are only partially effective or perhaps failed completely. It's rare that people fail completely, but sometimes they do. But usually a good, what might be a good solutions journalism story is a good response that is, doing better than a previous response, but it's by no means perfect. And so it's this kind of iterative kind of learning that you're always adding to. It's almost like science. You're always adding more knowledge to the to the full the full network of knowledge.
Yeah.
And then getting it into people's hands so that the teacher, the frontline person, whoever it is, can have a better method.
It gives us a handhold. It's so empowering, and I'm so curious as I'm sitting here listening to you share this. What do you feed your brain? Where do you consume? Where do you go to consume your news, and how do you consume it?
Oh wow! I mean, I just kind of pull in. I have a kind of big network of people that I've interviewed over the years who are often experts in their subjects, because one of the reasons why I wanted to write about them was that they were doing something really creative with trauma or in education or energy or whatever. So I'm on a lot of people's mailing lists and I just hear about things. I have to say, I don't think there's I don't really get a lot of ahas that much from the general news. Mm-hmm. It's more from people who are working specifically in fields. I have to say, I have to talk about a book that I just read recently, though, that's really influenced my thinking and is wonderful. It's a book called Climate, a New Story, a New Story by Charles Eisenstein. And it's a great book because it's a complete reframe of global warming and how we think about climate. And really looking at what does it really take to restore and regenerate land that's been degraded, in some cases for centuries. And what does that look like when the land is restored? And there's these miraculous stories around the world that I had not heard about, of places that had been completely regenerated, in some cases after having been deserts for, hundreds of years, and they came back. And this is what's possible in terms of restorative agriculture, regenerative, land stewardship and all that, and how much that needs to be a part of the whole climate story. Much more about water and soil, not just carbon and methane and all that. And the thing that's really interesting is the reason why I'm answering your question, this was a new input that I got from a book that was given to me by a friend who runs really cool organization that's done a lot of work in restorative agriculture. So he gave me this book. He said, read this. And then reading that book, there's all these leads, and I called up a whole bunch of people in the book to learn about it. And then that's going to lead us in the direction with solutions journalism in helping reporters around the country and in other countries report on the question, how are people repairing Earth?
That's great. And that's a great example because I think I get it now, right? All the news stories are about we're destroying the planet. We're destroying the planet, CO2. And you're coming up with there's people fixing the planet. There's people restoring.
Repair is happening, okay?
Yeah.
And the thing is, there's actually quite a bit of research now about the coverage of climate change and how counterproductive it has been, if not like really bad, bad, big problem. But there's a fair amount of acceptance now, even in journalism, that the coverage of climate has to change. We have given so many dire warnings to people that it's like the school teacher that just the kids don't hear when she yells anymore.
So
right.
true.
There's nothing we can do. It's past the point of no return. And
even the people who are alarmed, like there's categories of people around climate change. There's the highly skeptical all the way up to the alarmed. Even the people in the alarmed, if you ask them, so what do you think you can do about it? They're like, I don't know, buy a Tesla or something. There's not like, there's 50 different things you can do at an individual level. And then there's a whole bunch of things that you can push for as a civic actor if you want to start getting mobilized into politics, or there's things you can do if you have positions in companies or positions in social organizations, which is why like the Drawdown, Paul Hawkins' work with the Drawdown Institute is so important, listing here's the 100 top solutions to global warming based on scientific evidence about what they would actually
What is that?
achieve.
What is that called?
It's called Drawdown. He would be a good person to talk to. Yeah. And the
where can people go? Is it like a Drawdown Institute? If we Google
just
search that.
Google Drawdown Challenge. There's also the Drawdown Eco Challenge. It's an amazing. We did a partnership with them where we connected solutions journalism to the examples of what they identify as solutions to a bunch of problems, and we created these collections of stories linked to their solutions. And the collections of stories are like a Spotify playlist of a bunch of stories that all connect around a theme. And the so one theme is like, how do you repair food systems that are highly wasteful? 40% of the food in the United States is wasted. It goes into landfill. It contributes to global warming. But you also have really interesting land management strategies. One that I had never heard of is called silvopasture, which you can Google to see what it is, but it's the combination of sort of trees and grazing lands together. And if you include that with the rotating of animals, it's just really good for the land. It's great for sequestering carbon. It's, and this has been known for a long time, but it turns out that this is, I think, number 9 on the Drawdown solution list in terms of the potential for reducing the carbon footprint around the world. There's so much happening. Yeah. When you start opening your eyes to it, once people start hearing like, oh, our community has 20 options to deal with a whole bunch of environmental things. And the thing that's really key is people love the land.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
People love, it might be the streams that they used to fish in that now don't have fish anymore, or it might be, the farmland, which is not as productive as it used to be, or just the land around that used to be beautiful and now has been all developed up and is not an inspiring place to be anymore. And conservative people, the ones who, like the researchers tell you, are kind of skeptical of global warming, they might be skeptical because it's been so politicized and such an abused phrase for political purposes. But if you start talking to people about, the land,
conservation,
the soil, the water, the forests, people's hearts open up.
Yeah.
That's what they need to talk about, rather than constantly going back to these old frames that have been, people have made a lot of money by making people polarized around these issues. It's been a very effective and clear strategy. So,
It's so true.
Where do, if our listeners hopefully will get very intrigued by solutions journalism, where do they go to read solutions journalism? Where do we go?
Well, so we have a bunch of resources that are, we have one thing called the Solution Story Tracker, which today contains, I could tell you the exact number, but it's at least 7,100 stories.
Wow.
That have been gathered from close to 1,000 news organizations. Many of them are partners, many of them news organizations that have done solutions journalism on their own, or perhaps they've used some of our tools to sort of get familiar with it. But we aggregate this. This is all done by hand right now. But if you type in any issue, like you could type in climate change or diabetes or opioids or graduation or whatever the issue is that you're interested in, you'll see lots of stories, in some cases hundreds of stories, that are sort of, it's like a heat map of how people around the world are responding to this problem. And then we added to that this thing called Solutions U, which you can just Google solutions journalism and then the phrase Solutions U altogether. And you'll see we have hundreds of collections where we've combined stories around themes, like here's how cities are reducing their carbon footprint, or here's how communities are improving prospects for people who need to transition to a new economy, or whatever it is. So the idea is that there's opportunities to find this if you come to our site.
Great.
And then there's lots of news sites that have created their own solutions sections. Like the BBC has a podcast called World Hacks, which is a solutions-oriented. The Guardian has a section called The Upside, which is all about solutions. We have the fixes columns at the New York Times. And then there's many news organizations around the country that are doing solutions journalism more often, and sometimes not labeling it, so that people don't even realize they're getting a latte, not an instant coffee, and they don't even realize it. So that's the next level, is really helping the news organizations to break down the fourth wall and to actually say, wait a minute, we've shifted. Have you noticed?
That is so inspiring.
Yeah.
It's just with some friends who are involved in the film industry, and they were talking about the need to create that in film as well. One of the pieces that came up was the beautiful Salt of the Earth about Sebastião Salgado, in which he goes through he's this phenomenal photographer who photographs some of the worst things that have ever happened to humanity, from the worst mines to wars, everything. I mean, his work is just outrageous.
I wonder what he's carrying inside him. Yeah, it's
so powerful. And at the end of the film, he goes back to Brazil, to this farm, and the farm has been totally deforested and it's dead and it's arid and people are starving there and it's just awful. They start planting trees and they do exactly what you were describing.
Yeah.
And by the end of the film, you see this place just come totally alive. And by the end of the film, you see the stream. I don't mean to spoil it, but it'll be just as exciting if you see it.
What is the name of the film?
It's called Salt of the Earth. And it's a stunningly beautiful film. And by the end, it gives you that exactly what you're describing, that feeling of hope. It's not that huge of a piece of land, and he's planted thousands of trees that have totally changed the ecosystem in that area. Now it's contagious. The other communities around are saying, wow, what happened there? And they keep expanding it out. So especially as the Amazon burns, I feel it's a really important film for people to see.
So important, yeah.
Because it will give that taste of hope that nature is regenerative and that animals will come and plants grow. And, this earth has such power to reinvent herself. It's amazing to see if we give it the chance.
A shout out to our sponsor, The Great Courses Plus. We are just incredibly grateful to have this amazing sponsor. The Great Courses Plus is a streaming service of incredible content, lectures and courses for anything that you want to do. If you're interested in continuing to learn, to explore new things, this is the site for you. You can take courses in wine tasting. I'm listening to a course on the history of the three-pointer in basketball, because I've got this huge yearning for basketball now that the season's over. Anything you want. If you want to learn meditation and yoga, learn a guitar, this streaming service is amazing.
Yeah, actually, Santiago is taking the guitar class right now. It's really good.
Is that right? Mm-hmm. And then you've got a couple of courses on there, right? Tell us about Yoga Nidra.
So yes, I have a whole course on iRest, integrative restoration, Yoga Nidra for deep relaxation, 24-class series. It's half lectures and half practice classes. There's classes on how you can use meditation for sleep, how you can use breathing in meditation, how you can use it for stress management, anxiety, all the things that so many people are facing right now.
That's great. That's great. And you know what, Molly, in these times when we're all sitting at home in the middle of the coronavirus, stay at home, what a great way to get away from watching Netflix movie just for a little bit and focus on learning and exploring new things with your family. Our listeners are going to get the deal of the century here. Listeners, listen up. If you sign on to thegreatcoursesplus.com/Molly, you're going to get a free month for the entire library of content of the Great Courses Plus. So the Great Courses Plus, all one word, write out the word plus, .com/Molly, Molly, and start enjoying this amazing content.
Another person along those lines is the filmmaker and now soil scientist John D. Liu. That's John D. Liu. Not nearly as well known as he should be. He's been chronicling land restoration since 1995. He started on the Loess Plateau in China, which people don't know is like an area literally the size of Belgium that has been restored through a massive effort. This is an area that is the reason why the Yellow River is called the Yellow River. It's because the soil was so dried out that it would just, when the rain came, it would just wash it into the river. Now it actually is a green place again after having been brown for like 1,000 years. And John, with his film, has chronicled this kind of thing around the world. He's gone to lots of countries and shown this kind of like the death and life of planet Earth kind of story over and over. And it's just, you watch these scenes because he shows you the same place in 1995 and then 15 years later, 2010, and you just can't believe it. It's kind of like looking at someone who's like severely malnourished and desiccated, and then 15 years later, like healthy and
it's so inspirational.
Running a marathon.
I want to watch that tonight. That sounds
so David, what inspires you?
Well, these stories. I mean, I have to say, I don't know how people cope if they're really tuned into the news every day. I don't know how they actually deal with it. I am fed every day by stories that just come in because of this network, and before the network, just my own reporting. I mean, I was just looking at people creatively solving problems around the world. That hundreds. I don't know how many people I've interviewed over the years with all the writing about the social change stuff, but my head is just filled with kindness in action, or what Bill Drayton called love and respect in action, which is one of the meanings of the word Ashoka, I believe. Yeah. So I have a head full of that, and still, you hear about the new report on biodiversity, the number of species that are going to go extinct, or whatever is happening to the ugly populism that you see, rising up, the sort of the xenophobia and immigration laws and stuff like that. Immigration, knowing that that's only part of the story. That there is suffering and illness, but there is also a lot of repair happening. Yeah. That's the main thing. So, and I think people have to be constantly fed that, because otherwise, if you only hear about our troubles, and if you only really are focusing on the ugliness of the world or the meanness of the world, then your natural instinct is to sort of, I can't focus on the commons. I can't focus on all of this stuff out here. But I can create a beautiful little rose garden in my backyard, and I'll focus on private things. I'll make sure my 2 kids get a good education rather than all the kids in the community. We become more of a privatized sphere. We trench. And there's an interesting, I was reading something by this guy, this author named Stephen Mintz, who had written a book about childhood in America called Huck's Raft. He's often described as sort of like the historian of childhood or something like that. And he was doing an NPR interview or something, and he said the phrase "our kids," if you look at how it was used historically, it meant like all the kids in the town. And now it's usually meant like our 2 kids. And boy, they better get into the private school, or we're going to even do corrupt things to get them into Yale and Harvard, as we've seen, right? Yeah. And so why are people so focused just on their 2 kids and not on our kids in the community? What would drive that shrinking of the circle of empathy? What would drive that? I mean, we can blame it on people. We can just say people are bad. But no, we know that people are situation driven. So what is the situation that causes people to shrink their circle of empathy, and how do we reverse that? And I would say if you load people up with a lot of fear every day through a media source that is just endless, and TV shows and Quentin Tarantino films and all of the violence, you will cause people to shrink their circle of empathy and you know what? It's probably healthy and protective to do that. It's probably necessary. Exactly.
Yes.
That's really interesting. But if you I wonder if we've shrunk the circle of empathy, or whether it's been shrunk for a long time to some degree. I mean, this is not a recent phenomenon, right?
Yeah, it's not one way, because you look at the young people and they're, at least with the rights-based thinking, you know, the feeling that everybody needs to be included, everybody's feelings need to be respected, and we need to consider, really consider in a radical way how our systems have been, you know, biased and created.
But David, you say you don't know how people cope with all the negative news. I don't think they are. I think anxiety is rampant, right? More people are on anxiety medication than ever before. And, you know, Vera, I keep talking about Vera. Yeah. Vera says in social inclusion, the volunteers that work in her organization, she says it's the natural Xanax. You know, she goes, helping people.
Yeah.
Or this concept of bringing people together to solve issues is stronger than any drug you can get out there. And today there's a lot of anxiety, and I think it has to do with this issue, this bombardment of news, of polarization.
Yeah.
And, you know, getting into the light stories, positive stories of the amazing stuff that's going on is part of the solution, right?
And Vera has,
No, go ahead.
Vera, you know, she used to describe, like you said, like this work being a kind of antidepressant. And there is a lot of depression among the wealthy in Brazil who are hugely disconnected. It's such a divide. And then there's these, like, you know, if you think about, there's a wonderful book called Lost Connections, which talks about the ways we're disconnected and how it contributes to depression and anxiety and things like that. It's really a good book. The three core disconnects are sort of the disconnect from self, loss of connection to self, loss of connection to the other, to other people, and then loss of connection to nature. And those, and Otto Scharmer has called them the three great divides. If you look at sort of the core of sort of gross national happiness in Bhutan and some of the core Buddhist principles, they're grounded in connection, deep connection to self, deep connection to others, and deep connection to the land and to nature. And, you know, it's really interesting to see, like, what causes people to shut down so that they don't even feel their feelings, you know, which is probably connected, you know, to, you know, anxiety. Like, you have so many people that medicate, whether it's with alcohol or whether it's with stronger drugs or just with distraction, with Netflix or whatever. And it's really fascinating to see, and even the Ashoka Fellows, by the way, there was a well-being study that was done of social entrepreneurs, and they found that a very high percentage use alcohol too much, and a high percentage
are depressed,
or we need to get them meditating,
or divorced. Exactly.
They created a program at Ashoka for these fellows around meditation, about just to help them cope with, because they're solving really stressful, difficult systemic problems and don't have a lot of help in that.
And that's why it's such an important thing I'm so happy to hear that they do that, because if we're operating from that fear place and the anxiety place, it's, you know, we have the science. Prefrontal cortex shuts down, amygdala grows, making us more negative, emotionally oriented, and making us less able to be in the present moment, afraid of what's happened in the past, fearful of the future. And that contraction happens actually on a physiological level where the system shuts down. So if our change makers, if our decision makers, if our soldiers, if our leaders are not doing something to connect with consciousness, whatever pathway whoever wants to use, that is affecting the way the world is playing out. I mean, our experience is what we put our attention on. If your attention is on anxiety and an inability to be self-aware of that, you're going to be owned by that. You will become that. And so that, you know, to create environments where we're regularly, daily, multiple times a day, taking those steps back, whether it's through meditation or prayer or time spent listening to each other, not just about the work of the day, but of what's present, whatever that might be. Those situations, creating those environments, will change people's ability to feel like they can do something. It'll change how they do it. It'll change how they treat each other while they do it. And we see it happening. I mean, my God, the U.S. military now, they've paid us. We've trained 2,000 teachers at 65 bases and VAs in yoga and meditation. And it's so they get that changes things, both from a resilience perspective and from a trauma perspective. But I feel that, and it is happening. It needs to go viral. It is going viral.
Yeah.
But even more, we need to keep turning up the volume on it. And David, I want to shift a little bit here, if you don't mind, to ask you, because I know you're a meditator, and you can feel it in your presence. But what led you to meditation, and what role do practices like that play in your life, and how do they affect your world, your work?
Yeah, well, I came into meditation in a crisis. I had 4 deaths in my family in a 4-year period. People I was very close with. Wow. And I didn't realize, but I had gone into a depression. I didn't even realize it until a good friend kind of pointed it out to me. I was still functioning, but I was kind of like, he's like, you're not yourself. And I didn't really understand it because I was kind of inside it. So my friend Kevin, he just kind of talked me into, he basically guided me into a meditation retreat that I didn't know what meditation was. And I've really lived much of my life in my head. I've been a thinker for most of my life. And, just sort of the analytic part of me was very in the forefront of how I would experience things. So I just got into this retreat with Jack Kornfield. It was a 5-day retreat. It was, I guess, 10 or 11 years ago. I'm not sure exactly. And that was, I remember, it was a 5-day thing, and I kind of felt like I was a glass of water from a New York tap. Like, you pour it out, and it's very cloudy, and then it's a little less cloudy, and then you look at it 10 minutes later, and it's gotten clear. And I could feel like Monday I was really cloudy, Tuesday I was really cloudy, Wednesday I was really cloudy, Thursday I was clear, and then on Friday I was already planning to come back to New York, and so my mind was very busy. But I had one day probably one morning of just feeling like, oh, this is what it's like when your mind isn't just racing all the time. And a lot of emotion came up that I didn't expect. As soon as I sort of got really still, all of this emotion came up. And it was sort of emerged, and it flowed out of me in different ways. And that was sort of the beginning. And actually it helped me I would say pretty quickly, maybe 3 or 4 months. It got me back into feeling much more, sort of back to being myself. But ever since then, my analytic part of me has never been quite as dominant. I've sort of continued to move in the direction and done a lot of...
May not be a bad thing.
Yeah, now it's now I kind of my wife is a very sensual person, and we'll go to a movie and see 2 completely different movies. I'll be thinking about it and how it was written and how the narrative was constructed, and she's really just feels it in her body.
That's funny.
And I find myself more getting what it's like to experience life that way, and just and I enjoy it. Yeah, it's just so. But
I would bet that the analytical side is still there, but you also now are having the balance where you can be in conversation with both, perhaps.
Yeah. I mean, and when the teachers say the mind is a tool, it's a bad idea when it becomes the master, but it's a very good tool. I never knew what that really meant. Now I kind of understand it. When it is not, it's a very good tool. It's like a calculator or something, or sort of a pattern matching tool or whatever. And that's good when you need to solve a problem. But it is also just the mind is just constantly sort of salivating thoughts. I mean, it's not like you can turn it off. It's it's just going all the time. And some of them are really useful, and some of them are just the crazy person on the bench next to you, shut up already. It's who asked you?
You're a really curious person, though. When we were talking about before this podcast, you're talking to Molly about tell me about your experience, and it was meditation. What kind of meditation? How'd you get into? You're naturally very, very curious. My sense is that you not only practice meditation, but you've sort of studied it and you understand it. And I think that's a real gift. I practice meditation, but I don't know a lot about I sort of do my meditation that I learned, and I know a little bit from what Molly does, but I don't have that curiosity. It really inspires me because
you seem really curious.
I am, but I'm also
thing.
German and a logistician, and I follow my path. I'm a very focused person. So, I do transcendental meditation. I love transcendental meditation, and I probably won't do anything other than, even though what Molly does is really inspiring to me. So it's interesting that way,
but
because
different people can serve different ways. And what I love about Hans is, you plant the seed in Hans, and if you can convince him it's a good idea,
I run with it.
He does not miss his twice a day meditation.
No.
If you can convince him it's a good idea, he does it every day. And I find that in the military too, where if you can get to the place where they can realize that they will have an effect, they won't put it down. Whereas I can go teach in a yoga studio and people float out of there and then the practice goes away.
Right.
So it's interesting, different personalities engage it in different ways. So I'm happy you do TM, but what I'm most happy about is that you do it every blessed day, twice a day.
Damn right. Can't do without it.
Very
I think I talk to people about, well, how can you spend, 2 hours a day meditating, or, hour and a half a day meditating? And I say it buys me time. I really believe it. I always talk about calmness, clarity, and capacity. I believe I get more done with meditation than without meditation. I not only believe it, I know it, because I'm ready. I'm ready. I'm open. I'm present. I'm ready to rock and roll. And
you're there.
Yeah.
I mean, I always go back to Jack Kornfield's first retreat, because he's so funny. And he would I remember one of his stories that he told was this guy who lived in a village. He had a farmhouse, and he was a meditator. And somebody said, how long does it take you to walk from your house he lived outside a village, to walk from your house to the village? And he says, on average about 2 hours, but that's not my best time. My best time is 6 hours. Right?
That's perfect.
So it's and then there was this other guy at the retreat who was talking about, after 3 days meditating, he ate an orange, and he said, and it was the best orange I'd ever eaten. It was so delicious. And Jack's response was well, that's because you were there when you were eating it.
Exactly.
Right.
Are we human doings, or are we human beings? Can we be present while we're doing it?
Yeah. And the curiosity is an interesting thing, because that was actually part of this crisis that I went through a number of years ago after How to Change the World came out. I had this experience of suddenly I was doing these speeches for 5 years straight. I would just have all of these, anyone in the world who was interested in social entrepreneurship got in touch with me to do a keynote talk. And suddenly I became, quote, the expert. And I'd get on the stage and everyone would be like, teach us about social entrepreneurship, Mr. Bornstein kind of thing. And I actually would get on the plane after, doing this thing. And it's a nice experience. People fly you, they put you up in a hotel, they take you to dinner, you're the guest of honor kind of thing. You give a talk in front of 500 people. People line up to sign your book.
They pay you for it.
They pay you for it, and they fly you back, and you're like, what's wrong with it? And I would get back on the plane going home, and I would just feel a kind of, a vague sort of sadness or dullness in my experience. And I couldn't understand it. And then I was talking to a friend of mine about this, who was a very skilled meditator and knew me well, and said, well, just think about it. All your life, you've been living in the questions. You're a question asker. You've been living in your bafflement, in your sense of wonder. And now you're pretending you're this expert on stage, and you're the person with answers. And that's just not who you are. You've been faking it, or being what you think people want you to be. And he said, can you just be in the questions, even if you're giving a keynote talk? These are the questions I'm now thinking about. This is where these stories have brought me, and this is what I'm still curious about and going down. And so still be yourself in that position. It was a really interesting insight. And so I don't like to do talks anymore. I don't do much of it because I don't enjoy it that much anymore. But when I do it, which is usually with young people, I love doing it with students and things like that, I go into that place, and then it's a much more enjoyable experience,
What does still baffle you?
So these main questions is we travel around the country. We work with news organizations across the U.S., across the world now, but we really have most of our imprint here. And about 66% are between the coasts. So it's a lot of kind of middle America. There's so much, we hear from our news editors, what should we be covering? Mental health. How do we take care of our elders? Addiction. A lot of stuff related to the justice system. And I keep on thinking, like, how is it that with all of our knowledge and insight into human nature, that we've created systems that produce so much suffering and so much disconnection and, in fact, loneliness? Because that's another thing. The former Surgeon General, Vivek Murthy, has gone around the United States talking about how loneliness is a public health epidemic.
Absolutely.
And so we're like, how did that happen? What is and how do you then unwind that? How do you turn these systems? Because we can cure many forms of cancer, many infections. I mean, people live with things that they would have died at the age of 40. We don't want to turn the clock back on like all of the cool things that science, technology has done, and the fact that we don't have to spend just our entire day just getting the food we need to live. So we don't want to turn back the clock. But on the other hand, with all the advances we've made, why is it that we've created a machine that seems to be making people feel disconnected and unhappy too often? Not always, but
we see too the pendulum shifting, because that profound loneliness will just drive you into the hole. But what now? The only cure for it is connection, and until we can really connect with ourselves, we can't connect with other people. So if we can create the conditions where that connection can flourish, it will change everything. Because when we feel each other, you can't be mean. You can't. I mean, you could maybe have a disagreement, but you can stay connected.
Yeah.
Even in the midst of disagreement.
Yeah.
Well, my aha moment today was our technology can be relationships.
Yeah, teaching people.
I love that.
Parker Palmer, who's one of my heroes and a friend, who's gone very deep into this idea of wholeness. He wrote a book called A Hidden Wholeness.
What's it called, sir?
Parker Palmer. And he created an organization a number of years ago called the Center for Courage and Renewal, which does these workshops around the country where it's just this beautiful model for how to actually create deep connections and deep relationships in a relatively short period of time. So that's a kind of technology. Like they have this way of pulling a group of people together and turning them into something that, like, I meet people that I was at this retreat 10 years ago and haven't spoken to them since then. And it's kind of like there's a closeness, a sense of friendship or affinity that was built in that time. And it's kind of like a miracle how that gets created in these communities. And there's a lot of communities that are coming up around the country. And one of our other co-founder, Courtney Martin, who wrote this wonderful book called The New Better Off. And the title is, Your Generation is the First That Won't Be Better Off Than Its Parents, all the economists have been saying. And she said, what do they mean by better off? And it turns out what they mean is more stuff, right?
Money.
More money, more houses, more cars, blah, blah, blah. So she said, well, what is the new better off according to my generation? What are people who have options actually doing? And she found co-housing, downsizing their lives to have more time for family and friends and all this. She went around the country and she wrote a whole bunch of stories about it. And that's the idea, that people, if they have the options, and that's one of the sadnesses, is a lot of people don't have the options. I mean, just working 80 hours a week to keep the roof on your kid's head, and food is, people are so busy that it's very hard to do that. But the people who do have options and are thinking about these things are often shifting away from the sort of rat on a treadmill kind of life that has become, a country that gives you 2 weeks vacation and 3 months paid maternity leave. I mean, I come from Canada. My sister, who lives in Montreal, she got 9 months paid and 9 months unpaid. And that's the norm in Canada. You get a year and a half when you have a baby, and fathers can do the same. So there's something
that's inspiring to me. How my boys have no desire to buy a house. They're like, I'll rent because maybe in 2 years I want to be somewhere else and I want to have a different job or I want to take time off, or, to me, that whole better off, my culture was, well, you buy a house, and then you get it, that you settle in that's, there's some permanence to that, or there's some security in that. And that doesn't feel like better off to my kids. Better off to my kids is I want to work in a place that I value, a company that, has a value system. I want to buy products that I believe in, and I want to have a lifestyle. And sometimes I think, well, that's great, but make sure you cover your bills first. But I really admire that. And that gives me a lot of hope, because from that place comes this belief that we can influence our lifestyle. We can influence what kind of world we want to live in. We don't have to put ourselves in the box, right?
And they might not be thinking, make sure you cover your bills first. They might be thinking, make sure you take care of your soul first, and the bills second. The priority might be a little bit different. And that probably is a function of the fact that they grew up feeling safe. So, or they grew up without, I had a great aunt who grew up during the Depression. And I remember when it used to be long distance calls got super cheap and it was $0.01 a minute or something, she would still hang up really fast. Tell me, this is a 25-cent call. She's like, no, it's long distance. And
that's interesting.
So you grow up with, if it's in your body, if fear if a sense of security is something that you really you need to have, it's really hard to not get the money first.
It's so important. It really is such a function of our nervous system. If we don't feel safe, safety is a prerequisite of anything. It's of anything that is sustainable and long term. And so often we skip over it. It becomes side effect. But we've got to start with safety. Every relationship, every company, every organization. So we're all secretly craving it.
Yeah.
You're a voracious reader, huh?
I read a lot. Yeah.
What's your favorite book?
Oh, I don't have one.
You've got to have.
I don't have.
You got to answer this question.
I don't have
Desert Island story. Desert Island question.
I don't know. I guess the book that I could probably read 5 times would be The Brothers Karamazov. I guess just because it's, it deals with the deepest questions, and it's both funny. I mean, it's got caricatures and in a sense in the father, but also a really real character, and then this 100-page speech that is just sort of extraordinary. And then you have this character, this guy Alyosha, this character who's just something about what he's wired into. That was the question. How did he get wired into that, into love? How did he get wired into love is the sort of the core question of the one question. So it's just and I'm not a scholar of this book by any means. I've read it twice, but it's sort of
read it a long time
one
ago.
and a half, I guess, times. I sort of went through it quickly the next time.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Do you have any? I know you have a child. Do you have any favorite kids books?
Oh wow, for Elijah, for kids books. What did I read to him that I loved?
I like I don't know what it's called, but the end of the last line is, "And the tree was happy."
Oh, The Giving Tree.
The Giving Tree.
Yeah. Shell. Yeah. Yeah. Huh. I have to think about that. What did I read to him that we really loved?
I wrote some. I haven't published them yet, but I've wrote some children's stories. I gotta get around to that.
I love children's
Been sitting
books.
on my computer forever.
You should do it. I can't wait to read them.
I have to say, I really like the Phantom Toll Booth. Yeah, because it was just so playful with words and quirky and
Yeah, that's the key, is the quirky part. The kids love that stuff, and then they remember it. And if you skip a line, they correct you. And
I mean, I'm really interested in people who sort of help you realize that life is serious. This is a serious thing, but it's really ultimately bring a spirit of play and adventure and mischief to it.
Yeah.
And I was at my son goes to one of those sort of specialized high schools in the Bronx that's kind of all the kids. It's called Bronx Science, and it's a very a lot of kids there are I'm getting into Harvard kind of thing. And so they had a counselor there from a university, one of the sort of selective universities, telling them how to apply and how to write your essay and this and this. And you could just feel the feeling in the room. All the questions were is it better to write your essay this way? Is it better to, should I take 3 AP courses or 4 AP courses? And it was all these things about how do I put together my life as a portfolio that gives people what they want. So they let us into this really selective institution. And it's really interesting. Like, there's a whole why that is not even asked there. I mean, it's sort of like this, you could feel the pressure in the room. And you know, I mean, my hope is like, you know, like I have a friend, Nancy Lublin, who runs this thing called the Crisis Text Line, which is it's the largest source of information about people who are having crises in the United States now. I believe people text in if they're feeling anxious or suicidal, and teens use this. It's a really important resource because young people use text and they're able to really help many, many, many kids. But she sees so much of what young people are going through because of running that. And she just says, tell your kids they're enough. You can't tell them enough how much you need to tell them that they're enough.
Well, it's like, where do we go away from ourselves? We tell them that in their childhood, and then we also say it's really important to go to a good school and do this and that. And it's like people go away from themselves when they feel not enough or not safe. And so it's that same thing. It's like we've told them the whole time, like, follow, what is your interest here? Do this. And then all of a sudden now you're being measured. And it's like the points when we need a rite of passage, to go back to some sort of archetypal thing of, you know what, like, you're awesome even if you don't get into that school.
That's right.
It's like you're awesome because you are.
Yeah.
Right. It's not just kids.
Not just
You're enough.
Yeah.
You're enough.
Actually, you just reminded me of another favorite book. It's a book called How Children Fail. Believe it or not, it's really about how children succeed, but it's about how it's by John Holt, who became a home educator because he was so distressed by exactly what you just said. He would study little children and how, like, he'd watch his niece, for example, and how, she was just a constant experimenter. You try to stand on a ball when you're 2 and you discover you can't stand on balls. The milk comes off the table when you pull it. And every experiment, he says objectively, almost all of her experiments end in failure, but it's perfectly fine. She learns so much. Learning. Someone picks her up and cleans up the milk and gives her a hug and sends her on her way.
So sweet.
And so she never stops experimenting. And then he fast forwards to elementary school when they get into kindergarten. And suddenly it's about, like, pleasing the teacher and getting the, quote, right answer. And so he has this, like, he gives this example of there's a teacher is doing this thing with, I think, grade 3 or grade 4 kids, where she says, I'm thinking of a number between 1 and 10,000. Can you get to that number through the fewest number of questions? And so the first kid puts up his hand and says, is it between 1 and 5,000? Best question you could ask. And the teacher says, no. And the kids all go, ah. And he says right there is you can see, like, they're hearing the no. They're not realizing they got...
He's just cut this thing in half.
They got it, and he cut it in half. And he says that's what the education system does. It orients people around yeses and gold stars and all these things. And the experimentation and the constant discovery has been sort of beaten out of you by the time you're in grade 2. So you become a performer based on what's expected of you. And then you get into the corporate world and, like, what's expected of you and all this. And suddenly you have people making these decisions like, well, just cut the trees down kind of thing, right? That they never would have made if they were actually who they are, Right. But the system that's their gold star behavior. But it started a long time ago,
Mm-hmm. And all those no's are not enough, It's like, it's interesting.
Yeah. It's so like,
interesting.
Helping
Can
people
the no
to
be yes? Yeah.
To change those systems and to make the systems much more. You see them around sometimes. I mean, sometimes the most creative things are family-owned companies, and the best social organizations run essentially like a family business, where you don't actually have to maximize anything. You just, like, do what you want to do because it's your family, and Grandpa would have done it this way, and he really cared about the town, and so we're going to do it this way. And it can be business infused with a lot of ethics, but that's because you don't have to maximize shareholder equity and could be sued if you give away more than 3% of your revenues or something like that. You can be sued So the system has made it really impossible in some cases in the large companies for people to be fully the kind of ethical, value-based actors that they would like to be. The ownership structures.
Yes.
make it hard. Yeah. So
we've taken a lot of your time.
how we doing?
Really, really appreciate it.
We truly
sort
do.
of what's amazing to me or inspiring to me is we've talked sort of at the beginning of this podcast about bringing all of you to whatever it is that you do as a profession or a passion, and I really get that sense with you. You know, you it feels to me like you're doing what you want to do and how you want to do it, and it inspires you every day, and that's inspirational to me. I think what you're doing here with solutions journalism is just fantastic, and I think it's going to hopefully that our listeners will get inspired by that and have some resources to really spend a little more time thinking about the amazing thing that is happening and giving hope to in a world where there's often a lot of negative messaging. So I really want to thank you for that.
Thank you.
So much fun.
I really appreciate your time too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. Best wishes to you.
Our podcast, Conversations Matter, is produced by Amalia Briggs. Our sound engineer is Matthew Tucker, and our amazing sponsor is the Great Courses Plus. Thank you. We couldn't do it without you.